we've been discussing these two perspectives, and we just said we're going to crack this open a little bit further, because what we want to do is understand the relationship with challenges to miracles. Now that we've understood where miracles are coming from, we understand where the idea of the reward for mitzvot are coming from. So now we understand the idea of challenges. We're not quite ready to dive into that, but that's going to start to be the picture that we're going to draw in chapter 6, and then we're going to flip it right back into miracles. But in order to be able to really get an idea of what this is all about, we talk about these two different perspectives. The idea of dat elyon and dat tachton. Dat elyon is this besides for God. And what that means is that the intensity of God's existence, and not just the intensity, but even higher, is beyond just the intensity. It's the actual reality of God's existence, renders everything else mute, because there's a massive difference between God's existence and all other existence. All existence is an existence because of God. So God is that which continuously creates. That's why he is the creator. He's not just a one-time. It's not just a one-time experience. It's a constant creation. He is the constant creator. He keeps everything in existence, and our existence only has existence because God wills it into existence. So, but God's existence is completely not dependent upon anything else. It is not suffused with anything else. There's nothing outside of God's existence. And this is, of course, what Maimonides explains in the very first chapter of his book Mishnah Torah. He says the difference between God's existence and everything else is made up of details. So you have in front of me, I have one table, but the one table, of course, is made up of the legs and the top and this, several pieces, the sheaves, and all that kind of thing. And those each are made up of several pieces of wood. And then when you break that down, it's made up of molecular structure, and the molecular structure itself is made up of further and deeper structures. So everything that we know of is broken down into details. At some point, they thought the atoms were the basic building block of humanity, and then they went deeper and they found quarks, and now they have subquarks. And I'm not into that world at all, so I can't even tell you what's beneath that. So it's basically it's you see further and further and further details, and there's no real concept of unity until you start looking at the larger picture. This is one table. This table is in one house. This house is in one city, etc. And then you can go out and you can get a bigger picture. On the other hand, God's existence is not made up of details. When we talk about chesed or gvura, when we talk about even the Or Ein Sof, we're just talking about as God relates to us and how God relates to us as the creations that he willed into being. But we are not outside of God. The Or Ein Sof is not coming from God to something else, because there's nothing else. And we said for that reason, and you can go on and on about this because this is obviously an infinite conversation, but that's the reason why we describe God as the true Yesh. He is the true existence. Yesh means he is. On the other hand, we are a true Ayin. Our existence is very, very temporary, it's temporal, it's limited, and it's, especially in comparison with God's Yesh, we are truly nothing. I once met a professor who, and this is way early when I was dealing with the University of Washington, and he started talking to me about string theory. And he said, our universe, the vastness of our universe is just one string of many other universes, and we are just a speck in that. And he says, that's why, I don't believe in Judaism. And I said to him, that's precisely why I do. Because in the vastness of it all, God chose us and chose this planet, chose this people, and chose me to be able to do certain things. And that's the magnitude of that is quite humbling and beautiful and incredible. So you can focus on the nothingness and basically say, okay, nothing means anything. But of course, the ultimate point is to realize that despite the nothingness, God picks us up and chooses and makes sure that we do have meaning. But in the vastness of it all, when you're looking at the supernal perspective, of course, there's that nothingness. Reminds me of the old joke, on Yom Kippur, the rabbi's really getting into this, and he falls down on his face. He says, God, before you, I'm nothing. Chazan really is touched by this, and he falls down on his face, and he says, God, before you, I'm nothing. And the president sees the Chazan and the rabbi on the floor saying, God, he says, God, before you, I'm nothing. The rabbi turns to the Chazan and says, look who thinks he's nothing. So obviously, that's not what we're talking about. The nullification and the recognition brings us to greater and greater humility in the recognition that despite our nothingness, God chooses us. And so that humility is what brings us to greater and greater heights. It's not because of us. So Dat Elyon, that's the Dat Elyon. Dat Tachton is our very, very physical perspective. I feel me. I have certain feelings. Sometimes I'm in the mood to be spiritual. Sometimes I'm absolutely not. Sometimes I'm distracted by very, very, not just unspiritual, but ungodly things. And in fact, evil things. That's the reality of our world. When I start really thinking about my world and thinking about my position in it, I recognize, the same way we just described, that despite my, disconnectedness, I recognize that something creates me. I recognize that I have life. I see air all around me, but I feel the air, I breathe the air, but I can't see it. And the same way, even within ourselves, we feel our life, we feel vitality, and we know that that's coming from somewhere. And so we put the pieces together, we recognize that God exists. We look at the entirety of the earth itself and how the biodiversity is absolutely astounding, but each system protects and feeds into the next system, and all the systems are so interconnected in just a magnificent way. The micro affects the macro affects the micro. It's really, really incredible when you consider all these different pieces. So when you work through all of the pieces in your mind, you come to the conclusion that there is a creator, that there's obviously something that's going on here. This is not just about me. But you don't understand that. Now, here's an interesting thing. I lived in Seattle for 13 years, and I don't know how many of you have been all the way out there, but Seattle sits in the shadow of a 14,400 foot volcano, Mount Rainier. And the first time we drove up to what's called Paradise, which is about the 6,000 mark on the mountain, the highest spot that you can drive up to, and you can hike higher or whatever. You're sitting on you're looking at this magnificent volcano. You can see the caldera all the way up over you. And it was just this, the magnitude of it, the massiveness, the power, and all that is just quite remarkable. And I was struck by two things. My first thought was, and now I understand the native religions. They lived out in the wild, and so therefore they looked at the wild and they saw the magnitude and the awesomeness, really, of the wild. And so therefore, it's very easy to say that this is a God. This is the ultimate power. That was the first realization. I never thought about it. You just think about the natives as basically, an uncivilized or backward kind of thinking people. The second thought was the deeper thought. That was just like the first time I had that thought. The second thought was, now I have an appreciation for Abraham, because Avram Avinu was surrounded by people who thought that way, and he recognized that this huge mountain with all of its power is really just the same as the pebble that I hold in my hand, and it's just a matter of scale. And the mountain is obviously bigger. Magma is hot rock. But they're really the same thing. And so his recognition that there's something beyond that is really, really incredible when he was surrounded by a culture that was pushing this idea. And I'd never thought about that. And likewise, when my wife and I went to Hawaii, and you learn a little bit about the Hawaiian culture, which was very much, again, the ocean is their God. Why? Because the most powerful thing for an islander is the thing that surrounds you. And so therefore, but again, the ocean is just a massive drop of water. So Avram Avinu's capability to be able to recognize scale and not to be overwhelmed by massiveness, and to recognize that God is in the details as much as he is in the massiveness, is really, truly remarkable. So that perspective is the perspective of Dat Tachton. I exist, the ocean exists, the mountain exists, and when we put the pieces together and I recognize that all of these things support life and they give us life and they do whatever they need to do in our natural world, we come to the recognition that there's one source for everything. That is Dat Tachton. That is our perspective. And that's what feeds into our understanding and appreciation for God. We are an existence. God is an ayin. God is that which we cannot understand. And then we said something very, very interesting. We said the fact is that you might think that Dat Tachton is really false because of the fact that it's coming from a human perspective. We said it's actually not so simple because truth has many layers to it. There is the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is, in fact, that nothing exists besides God. But if you are to function in that way, then nothing else besides God, if you're to function like that on a daily basis, you will not be able to function. You will not be able to go through your life and do the things that you need to do. There are halachot about going to the bathroom, right? But if a person is just in constant, shock, I can't do anything because God's existence, and then you're not going to be able to. No, we have to apply godliness even to the most bodily functions. So Dat Tachton is working within our world as we are capable of being able to perceive it. For us to be able to have some kind of recognition and perspective. So the lower level is truth in its own reference, in its own framework. It's not the ultimate truth, but it still is, it has an element of truth. So that's what we spoke about in chapter 5. Chapter 6. So now we're going to talk about allowing Dat Elyon to influence Dat Tachton. So Dat Tachton, the lower perspective, at least recognizes God's existence. It expresses some element of nullification to its source. But this perspective is incomparably greater when, through one's self-refinement, it is suffused with the supernal perspective. So he explained that, of course, Dat Elyon is something that we're not capable of truly absorbing. We simply cannot function on a level of Dat Elyon because in that case, I don't exist and my family doesn't exist and money doesn't exist and anything like that. You can't function working from that perspective. But when you take the ideas of Dat Elyon and you bring that and you draw that into Dat Tachton, and you think about that and you consider it on a constant basis, it brings you to a whole different level, and and you can allow it to refine yourself in such a way that you're able to be cognizant of what's what. You're able to more easily identify something as being godly, and you're also more easily capable of letting go of our own issues, so to speak, our own baggage, our own whatever they are, spiritual, emotional, mental, physical, whatever it is. So the Rebbe asks, how is it possible to absorb an idea that is completely beyond our frame of reference? The answer is, we feel our own separate existence, despite the fact that, as we said, our existence is utterly dependent upon that which is beyond us. We can even think that our existence is separate from any source. But here's an interesting thing. But the very fact that we can make this mistake due to our own self-assessment is because our ultimate source is the only one whose existence is self-contained. Our feeling of self is a reflection upon the fact that we were created by the one who is the only self. And it's a very, very, very mind-blowing idea. That our ego, is really a spin-off of God's own existence. So he says this reflection of God's essence is therefore found not just in the energy that creates existence, but even within existence itself. And therefore, there are unique times in which this essence can even be revealed within creation. So there are special times in which we become, ourself becomes totally distracted from ourself, and instead goes directly to God's self, and we lose our own need to be distant, our own desire to be disconnected. And that's something that happens in rare occasions, but it happens specifically with regards to the idea of Mesirat Nefesh, the idea of self-sacrifice. And that's what we're going to lead up to, because we're talking about challenges. I think one of the most remarkable stories of self-sacrifice is found in the classic Yafa Eliach book, Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. She interviewed extensively a Hasidic Rebbe who was actually the oldest Rebbe to survive the Holocaust. His name was called the Blushever Rebbe. Rabbi Yisrael Spira was his name. And he lived quite a long life, actually. So he interviewed Rabbi Spira. Spira's first wife and children were killed. He married a woman afterwards, and she was also a survivor, and they had children afterwards. And Rabbi Spira's stories are really quite remarkable on many perspectives. But one of them is really shocking. I don't remember, I think they were in Bergen-Belsen at the time, and several of them wanted to, be able to daven on Yom Kippur. And obviously the situation was not exactly tenable. And so discussing amongst themselves, they decided they were going to do something that was really, really what we might call a wilde idea, very, very wild, very kind of out of the box. There was a capo who was known to be absolutely vicious. He was Jewish, but he was known to be one of the worst of the worst. And because he was such a vicious guy, the Nazis, basically gave him carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. So knowing that you never know with this guy what his reaction is going to be, they came over to him and they asked him if he could, they said, Yom Kippur's coming up, we'd like to be able to daven together, can you figure something out? And they knew that he could basically just turn around to them and basically say, okay, and then go straight to the Nazis, telling them, and that's it, game's over. But they obviously wanted it, so they were going to push for it. So the guy reacts like shocking. You're coming to me to ask me about Yom Kippur? They said, yeah, you're a Jew. And a Jew knows what Yom Kippur is. You know what Yom Kippur is. We want to be able to daven Yom Kippur. He says, let me think about it. So this is basically, worst case scenario, because what does that mean? Comes back to them several days later. He says, okay, I've come on an idea. You guys are going to clean one of the officers' quarters in a certain hall. There are very tall windows. He said, we'll put the rabbi up on a ladder and he'll be cleaning the windows with rags that will not have any water, so he doesn't have to squeeze. Squeezing is not allowed on the holiday. He obviously knew some basics. And the rest of you will be polishing the floor. And that way he'll daven, you guys will answer amen, you'll do whatever you need to do, and I'll be watching you. So that was the plan. So in the middle of doing this thing, when in walks a Nazi, he sees what's going on, and he figured out what's going on. Without saying anything, he walked out, comes back 5 minutes later with a trolley full of food stacked to the gills, stuff that they hadn't seen in years. And he said, Juden fress, and Jews eat. Nobody moved. He starts screaming, Juden fress. This capo turns to him, looks him straight in the eye, and says, on Yom Kippur, we do not eat. If the place was silent before, now it's even more silent, because it's just shocking that a guy who is basically responsible for the death of Jews, I don't know if he was a murderer himself, but he was certainly not a religious man in the slightest. Now he's standing up and saying we Jews do not eat on Yom Kippur. The German is even shocked, and the German pulls out his gun, holds it to the guy's head, and tells him his name, and I forgot his name. You can look it up in the book afterwards. He tells him by name, he says, Fres. And this capo responds with the exact same words, it is Yom Kippur, we do not eat. And he was killed then and there, what we call Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's life. Now here's a guy who had lived the opposite of self-sacrifice his entire, or a significant amount of life. And something clicked, something just took over, and he was not capable of separating himself from God in that moment. And this is exactly what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is the avodah, the work to be able to absorb this into ourselves so that we are capable of expressing this even out in our daily life somehow. But there are moments in which even people on the bottom of the spiritual totem pole are simply incapable of disassociating themselves with God. And that's the moments that we're talking about, those unique times in which the essence can even be revealed within creation. The kunst, so to speak, the trick and the point that we're trying to get here is to be able to absorb these ideas into ourselves without having a gun to our head, without having any of this kind of struggle, without the visceral struggle of basically, okay, somebody's going to kill me if I don't do this. No, the point is to be able to find it within ourselves, and that is something that really anybody can do. It doesn't take a spiritual giant. It just takes somebody who's willing to think about this and to be able to absorb it into themselves. I read a remarkable story yesterday. There was a strong man by the name of Joseph Greenstein. He was a Jew who grew up in Poland. Crazy story. You can look him up online. It's known as the Mighty Atom because he was 5'4", and he would bend horseshoes and bite through nails and stuff like that. One of these old time vaudeville characters. And the book was written by somebody who it was Jewish but not observant, so it's hard to tell exactly his, whether the guy considered himself to be an Orthodox Jew or just a traditional Jew. It's very hard to tell exactly what's going on, but there's no question whatsoever that this guy was at least spiritually aligned with his Judaism. I don't know exactly to what degree, and it's not for us to judge, but basically my point is that he wasn't a classic Orthodox Jew, because the fact of the matter is that he's walking around and doing, doing tricks in a loincloth, for God's sake. That's not what you typically see an Orthodox Jew doing. Again, that's my, what do you call it? I'm not trying to, belittle one person or the other, especially because what he did was quite remarkable. And, it's very, very impressive. And I dare say that many of us might have struggled with this. And he had this alignment of self, which was very, very, very specific. He was selling health products in a fair somewhere in the deep south, and and a Christian priest came over to him and started talking to him, and he basically told him, listen, you have your religion, I have mine, go away. And the guy thundered at him, if my way is true, you will see a sign. And within an hour, he started getting business from all over. I mean, and within, by several hours, he had sold out all of his products, and it's just basically just totally quite shocking. And he turned to his wife and he said, this is really weird. I don't know what happened. His wife said something's not kosher here. And he decided to go to this priest. This priest was actually in his church. It was Sunday. And he walks in, the priest says, welcome, brother. And he looks around and he sees that all the congregants have his products, bags and bags of his products. He pulls out the cash that he got that day and he threw it into the church. He said, you can have it, and walks out. And here's a guy who was not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. And he was willing to throw out everything because it was tainted with this, by the fact that this priest was trying to use it to be able to convert it. And I find that just mind-blowing. And it came as a result of this guy's constant thinking about God, even though he was not, like I said, he was not your standard, standard Jew by any stretch of the imagination. But there was something very, very visceral within himself. And he was able to absorb that in and say, no, this is not mine. I'm willing to throw that out. And that's where we end off here. This then is the idea of the supernal perspective being absorbed into the lower perspective, even within my corporeal state, my physical state. I recognize that there is nothing but God. And the capacity to truly express this only comes from the essence as it was encapsulated within creation. There are those moments in which we can somehow totally let go of what is natural and what is typical, what is physical, and we just go straight into that space and say, look, there's nothing but God. If God wants to give me this, he'll figure out some other way to be able to do it. If God wants to give me life, he'll give me life, but I cannot live denying this. I cannot live outside of these parameters. And so those are unique moments. And the idea of trying to absorb the supernal perspective into ourselves is the idea of recognizing that it's not just a force that's somewhere out there and it's basically ethereal, it's theoretical, it's conceptual, it's God exists somewhere. No, God is the true existence. So we can understand from that, we can start to piece together where we're going with regards to challenges, with regards to spiritual tests. We can understand the idea is that once a person starts thinking about these ideas, when you come upon a spiritual test, when you come upon a challenge, the challenge is no longer about what the challenge is. The challenge is now a unique circumstance to be able to recognize God. And then it's a different, the experience is different. The practical difference for me is that because of this idea, when we were being told for 9 weeks before my kid was born that, you should prepare, and call the Chevra Kadisha and all that kind of stuff, it was painful. It was difficult. I didn't feel like I had the capacity to deal with it. But I was not stuck. My wife and I should say, it was not just about me. We were not stuck in a space of woe is to me. We had a responsibility and we wanted to figure out what that responsibility was. And two things. First of all, it made it infinitely easier to deal with, even though it still wasn't fun and it still wasn't, but it was okay. God, I don't know what's in your mind. I don't like this, but you're the creator and you're giving me something to do here, and I hope I figure it out. And that was basically that was the struggle, and that was the focus. That responsibility allowed us not to get stuck in self-pity and even self-doubt, just because self didn't make a difference anymore. Because it's not about how I feel. It's about what I need to do. So that's why it's important for me to teach this, because it's such a powerful idea, and it's so important for us to be able to know I have a purpose here. I need to accomplish something. And so that's the idea of drawing Dat Elyon into Dat Tachton. So next Wednesday we're going to do chapter 7 and possibly even get through chapter 8, which I think we will. But if we have any other quick questions, otherwise, I'm going to hand the mic over.
It's Isaac. I just wanted to say one thing.
Sure.
What is so beautiful about, and forgive me, I'm just not exactly dressed. The key issue, I think, with most people, certainly me, accepting the idea of a Bashefer and a Boira Olam is that saying yes means you then have to do something about it. It's not the problem of do you believe in God that's a problem. What's the problem is by saying that it means I recognize I have to do something about it that I don't want to do. It's not me anymore. It's somebody else who's in control. And it's that letting go of the control, I think, that is the hardest thing for a human being to do. And that's what we're asked to do. And constantly, and that's what makes us different. I had somebody ask me, what's the difference between you and me? And I said, I don't know. How many times do you think about God in a day? And he gives me a blank look. I said, right. I can't go to the bathroom without thinking about God. So if you want to know what makes us different is the acceptance on whatever level we can to do our best under the circumstances and as we understand it, to just thank him. It's not a matter of doing it because he ordered us to do it. It's like, what are you and me doing here to begin with? So for that alone, my father says you always have to say thank you. So that's basically it. I'm sorry, I'm just rambling. Have a good Shabbos. Thank you, Rebbe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the idea here was that we're saying that our self, which is typically that which distracts, can be a reminder that it comes from this essential source, God's own self.
And I think it's a very beautiful thing under terrible circumstances that you had to deal with. And it was one of the most beautiful things I heard of how you continue day to day with it. And that's all. Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem. That's exactly it.
Rabbi?
Yes.
That is absolutely incredible. That was to me. It seems like a superhuman act of diffikut, is if that's the proper word. I wanted to ask you, what do you think was the trigger with that terribly vicious capo who made him Stelzachakigan, who made him decide that he was definitely going to stand on the courage of Jewish conviction and not eat on Yom Kippur?
I think this is just conjectural, but I think it's a combination. I think it was his own seeing the self-sacrifice of these other Jews combined with Yom Kippur being what Yom Kippur is, that made him start to reflect on who he is himself. And so I think is that these other Jews combined with Yom Kippur being what Yom Kippur is all about, and there certainly is the spiritual effect of Yom Kippur that brought him there. That's what I have to say, but it's really incredible. I mean, there's the famous Gemara of the same idea of Yesh Kana Ilame B'Sha'achas. Rabbi Elazar ben Durdaya was involved with a prostitute at the time, and basically she made a comment, and he basically said, "That's it. I'm coming back to Judaism," and he started to do tshuva right there, to the point that he actually died as a result of his self just getting absorbed in recognizing everything that he had done. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's response was this is incredible, that there's some people who are capable of kind of going to their source in one moment instead of across the entire lifetime. What that means, what they have to rectify, all that kind of stuff. That there are things that still need to be done, as a result of things that they screwed up. But there's no question that this concept is really a remarkable one.
So that when they were, when the other Jews were offered the food, their refusal to take it stimulated in him a response that if they can do it, certainly I can too.
I think before that, I think even the fact that they wanted to pray in Yom Kippur, even though they knew that this was quite likely to be something that they would get killed. So they already demonstrated their self-sacrifice to him when they were asking him permission to pray in Yom Kippur. And I think that's what started to spin the wheels in his own head. Okay, who am I? What am I? And then it just started to drive the entire system, and it brought him to a certain place. That's my guess, but it's impossible to say. But it's a remarkable story. Rabbi
Yes.
Smith, sorry for taking some of your time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Absolutely. You're